There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a landscape when you believe you know its history. The silence of a story told and retold until every wild edge has been sanded smooth. You expect neat timelines, tidy causes, the comfortable human scaffolding of this happened because that happened. And then you stumble into a place, a ruin, a bone bed, a carved stone, where every neat story unravels, where the familiar timeline stretches and warps like sunlight across a cracked mirror. That contrast is where this film begins, with certainty and then the sudden, stubborn cloud of a local mystery that refuses to be folded into the comfortable narrative. We promise big revelations and open questions, not to tantalize you needlessly, but because the Book of Enoch and the stories woven around it have been pressed into service by so many different hands: priests, poets, archaeologists, conspiracy theorists, each reshaping the raw material to fit a hunger. What we want to do here is something both bracing and painstaking: to return to the text, to the places it touches, and to the material traces those places left behind, to ask, calmly and directly, what the Book of Enoch actually says, and what it does not say, about giants, about watchers, about the boundaries between human and other. We will do this together. You and I will walk fog-blanketed fields where shepherds still mutter old names. We will stand in museum galleries where teeth and pottery lie behind cool glass. We will return to the texts, the Hebrew fragments, the Aramaic shards, the Greek translations, and read them as carefully as if they were new. I will be authoritative where facts can be pinned down: dates, catalog numbers, measurements, the names of excavators, and the provenance of fragments. I will also be conversational, because none of this is done in a vacuum. We bring our modern questions, our cinematic appetites, our longing for moral clarity, and those shape how we interpret the past. Most of all, I will hold two things at once: skepticism and wonder. For every claim of giant skeletons unearthed beneath the hill, there will be a stratigraphic report, a catalog entry, a lab result. For every lab report, there will be an eyewitness memory, a folk song, a photograph that refuses to be reduced. Between the files and the folklore is where meaning emerges. Begin by picturing a quiet valley at dawn, fog clinging to the fields, a rain-fresh smell rising from the soil, and a farmer tracing an old ridge with a hoe. He finds a shard of pottery, then another, then a scatter of bone, not just animal bone but something that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up because it looks, at first glance, too large, too human. The first reaction in any small town is a story. Stories have weight, they travel fast. People say, giant, and suddenly the site is no longer just a place where people once lived, it is a hinge between worlds. That hinge is exactly what the Book of Enoch inhabits, the boundary between the human and the otherwise, the place where watchful beings descended, where the cosmos briefly loosened its rules and strange offspring were born. If you have come expecting a single, tidy answer, a shock documentary's headline, you will be disappointed. If you have come with the appetite to stand with us in those foggy fields and look properly, to weigh fragments of pottery against fragments of text, then we will get somewhere honest and surprising. What follows in this script is not a polemic and not a sermon. It is a documentary-minded pilgrimage, 6 to 8 sustained narrative segments, each orbiting a particular place or cluster of evidence that intersects with the Book of Enoch's imagery: giant bones, anomalous burial practices, megalithic constructions, local legends of lost tribes and tall ancestors. Each segment will be self-contained yet braided into the whole, and each will present competing theories: the archaeological, the folkloric, the theological, the speculative. We will measure dates with radiocarbon labs and isotope analyses. We will describe artifacts with centimeter precision. We will note who said what, when, and under which institutional pressures. And then, because human beings have always needed to imagine what it would be like to live in such worlds, we will conjure scenes. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, or standing before a stone with deep cup marks like eyes. This narrative begins with a short but essential clarification. The Book of Enoch is not a single, homogeneous text produced at one time and place. It is a cluster of writings: the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Epistle of Enoch. Some parts are older, some later, Some survive in full in Ethiopic translations, others only in Aramaic fragments unearthed at Qumran. Counting pages or chapters is a modern compulsion. What matters more is what the text does, how it crafts a world in which the heavens and earth touch, in which boundary crossing produces monstrous lineages and moral catastrophes, and in which the narrator insists on the implacable consequences of those crossings. The giants, the book mentions, Nephilim, in some translations, are described with biblical-sounding phrases, but their life, scale, and fate differ in different manuscript traditions. Sometimes they are simply violent and enormous. Sometimes they are pictured as the progeny of angelic beings and human women, an idea that has lit imaginations for centuries. What we must be careful about is moving from the text as a set of metaphors and transcultural motifs to mistaking every large bone or unusual grave for evidence of the Nephilim. Correlation is seductive, causation demands work. So we begin our first extended step beyond abstraction with a place where text and soil intersect in particularly combustible ways: the high ridge outside a small Anatolian town where, for generations, villagers have told of the tall ones, skeletons of tremendous size that were found when the new road was cut decades ago. Official excavation reports are sparse. The bone scattering was largely destroyed by construction. Yet, fragments survive in private collections and in the memory of an old mason who once helped clear the trench. This is the sort of place where myth and material rub raw against one another, where pottery sherds dated to the Bronze Age sit beside stories told as if they were eyewitness testimony. The stratigraphy gives us a date range, 3rd millennium to late 2nd millennium BC for the primary occupation layers. Some artifacts, a bronze-socketed axe, a small cylinder seal impression showing a human figure standing with upraised arms next to a horned creature, connect this site to broader trade networks across the Anatolian plateau and into the Aegean. Yet the skeleton reports, insofar as they exist at all, are anecdotal, and the giant measurements vary wildly depending on who is telling the tale. Now, let's be fair, extraordinary claims require extraordinary documentation. The archaeologist in the provincial university who catalogued the sherds is careful in print. She notes no skeletal remains of abnormal proportions in the material curated by the museum. The mason remembers large bones, femurs that seemed longer than a man, but also admits that in the crush of demolition, he may have filled wheelbarrows with material that was not carefully recorded. Here's where it gets tricky. Local oral culture is not less than written records. It is a parallel archive shaped by oral memory, ritual, and identity. But oral memory can also grow in the telling, especially when the social reward for telling a larger-than-life story is high. Still, for all the evidence, something happened here that continues to trouble the ground. We still don't know whether those bones were anomalous individuals, exaggerated collective memory, or a mixture of both. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn toward the ridge. You pass a field where shepherds sit with steaming tea and hear them murmuring about the tall ones, as if the valley were still lived in by their shadows. Maybe the truth is prosaic, a scatter of cattle bones misremembered as human, a medieval ritual deposit misinterpreted, or a skeleton extended by erosion and imagination. Or perhaps there is something more, a burial of an unusually tall lineage, a population with distinct nutrition and life habits, or even a pattern of funerary display that emphasized certain bones to make a social point about strength. We will weigh those possibilities with lab results where available and with what the landscape can still tell us about trade, migration, and social organization. For now, as we leave the ridge and the shepherd's low talk, we hold the dual posture required by any honest inquiry, skeptical of easy answers, open to genuine surprise. We still don't know. From there, we will travel to a different kind of site, a peat-bog in northern Europe where spectacular, bog bodies emerge, preserved in tan and darkened skin and hair. These are not giants. They are, in most cases, ordinary-sized people caught in extraordinary circumstances, ritual sacrifice, execution, a violent death that the bog arrested and preserved. Yet in nearby folklore the stories elongate. Harvest songs tell of giant kings, drowned in the marsh, of kings whose crowns sank like islands. Archaeologists who have measured bone lengths and done isotope analyses tell us about diet and migration, the high-protein marine diets of some, the childhoods far from their burial spots for others. The bog offers a methodological lesson: preservation biases matter. A place where soft tissue survives gives us extraordinary insight into clothing, hair, and surface wounds. It also distorts expectations about past populations as a whole. We will look at bog skeletons not to find literal Nephilim but to understand how preservation shapes myth. Still, for all the data, villagers still point to the bog at sunset and whisper of tall kings. We still don't know how much of that whisper is memory, and how much is longing. Next, we will stand in a museum gallery in Addis Ababa, where a full Ethiopian Ge'ez copy of the Book of Enoch sits in a glass case, its margins annotated by centuries of readers. The Ethiopic tradition preserved entire sections of Enoch lost in other languages. Without it, the book would be a puzzle with missing teeth. What we will do here is read closely. What does the text actually narrate about the giants? In some passages, the Nephilim are described as beasts that devour the earth's produce. In others, they are pictured as the terrifying consequence of angels mating with human women. Later interpolations moralize the story as an origin myth for evil on earth. The theological burden is heavy. Yet we must parse genre. Is the Book of the Watchers a literal history, a parable, a polemic? Scholars have argued each case. The text sits at the crossroads of apocalypticism and angelology, of ancient Near Eastern mythic motifs and uniquely Jewish interpretive frames. Reading it aloud in the gallery, you feel the lure of the dramatic image, of stars falling to earth, and the sky's custodians broken into lawless desire. But the image alone does not translate into archaeological evidence. We must keep our boots on the ground and our eyes on the ink. Throughout these segments, we will return to that same dual posture. We will report catalog numbers and radiocarbon dates and also quote the old songs that people sing by the hearth. We will present multiple, competing theories: the naturalistic, population biology and nutritional variants, the cultural, symbolic archaeology and funerary display, the textual, interpolations, translation shifts, scribal glosses, and the speculative, what some call, preternatural, explanations. We will not endorse the last without evidence. But we will not sneer at the human need for myth. Myths are not failed science but another kind of truth-telling that matters deeply to communities. Each segment will end, deliberately, with an admission of not knowing, because that is where honest curiosity meets its fuel. Imagine again, you're standing at an excavation grid under a blistering sun, a string of labeled squares at your feet. A small child hands you a pendant found in the 4B context layer, a copper ring with a stamped motif resembling a human with upraised arms. The field director, a woman with a doctorate and steady hands, measures the ring at 2.1 centimeters across and catalogs it as Object R324. She dates the layer to around 1200 BC. Nearby, an elder recalls her grandmother telling stories of tall people who came on the wind. The ring does not prove the story, but it does show the site's link to broader symbolic repertoires, gestures of power, images of otherness, ritual paraphernalia. When we piece together the ring, the stratigraphy, the isotopes, and the songs, what emerges is not a single answer but a textured bouquet of possibilities, each with its own evidence and its own blind spots. As we proceed through the next segments, we will visit a remote plateau where stone circles gather like watchful eyes and where local guides will tell you that their ancestors measured themselves against the stones. We will examine megaliths across the Atlantic Rim, New England dolmens, Irish passage tombs, and Andean terraces, not to argue for a single global people of giants, but to show how monumental architecture often translates into memories of larger-than-life builders. Monumentality itself creates myth. Yet again, materiality restrains fantasy. The stones are quarried, shaped, levered into place with techniques we can study. They tell of organization, labor, and the mobilization of belief. Sometimes the giants are a social metaphor for elite founders. Sometimes they are ancestral heroes reworked into a folk scale. We will also dwell on a less glamorous but more scientifically rigorous point: measurements. When someone says, giant, ask to see the femur, to measure from acetabulum to condyle, to confirm whether the length truly exceeds the tallest normal human range. Many impressive-sounding claims reduce, under metric scrutiny, to ordinary variation. Yet even ordinary variation can be revealing, indicating populations with unusual access to resources, or with genetic traits concentrated by kinship. Similarly, the presence of a few large skeletons in a burial ground might indicate a social elite or specialized role, not an entire race of giants. We will bring in forensic osteologists and bioarchaeologists to explain metrics and to caution against quick leaps from bone to narrative. And alongside bones and stones, we will examine trade routes and exchange networks. Giants, as a motif, travel along the same roads as pottery and metals. When a motif of a horned, larger-than-human figure shows up on seals from Anatolia and on stelae in the Levant, that pattern hints at shared symbolic vocabularies, not necessarily shared bloodlines. Likewise, isotope analysis of teeth can show whether individuals buried with giant accoutrements spent their childhoods in the same valley or came from far away. This is the slow, patient kind of evidence that either supports or challenges broad claims about population movement. Finally, in every scene we will invite you into the imagination. Picture the dawn, the fog, the shepherds, the ring in your palm, the stones that hold up the sky. These are not mere cinematic devices. They are the sensory keys that let us feel why these stories linger. The sense that the world once had edges we no longer touch, that there were lives and bodies and taboos we cannot fully now reconstruct but that still pull at us. In the end, the Book of Enoch is a text saturated with such pull. A mythic geography where the heavens loosen, where giants walk, where justice is a cosmic ledger. Reading it in the light of archaeology narrows some mysteries and deepens others. We will not show you a final verdict on giants. We will show you how to differentiate a story that grows in the telling from evidence that stands up to lab analysis. We will show you why certain images, fallen stars, watchful angels, colossal offspring, recur across cultures, and we will be candid about where the Book of Enoch fits into that pattern. We will also keep our eyes open for the genuinely strange, things that, after careful measurement and cross-checking, do not fit our neat categories. So take a breath. Picture the title again, heavy and provocative. The Book of Enoch Revisited, what it really says about giants. We are not here to promote a sensationalist headline. We are here to do the work that turns wonder into knowledge and to keep a small, precious space for mystery when the evidence insists it must remain. Keep listening. Keep asking. Picture the fog, the ridge, the ring in a child's hand. Above all, keep the posture of curiosity that is at once rigorous and humble. We are about to begin. There are places where the stones themselves seem to remember the weight of bodies, not just the bodies of the living, but the fossilized trace of how a people arranged themselves in the world. At the Anatolian ridge, the line of terrace fields and ruined walls tells of communities that raised their children in a landscape threaded by trade and by seasonal herding. Pottery sherds, thin-walled bowls with combed decorations, fragments of a dark burnished ware, sit in a low museum drawer, catalogued under accession numbers that read like quiet timestamps of scholarly attention. The primary occupation layers on that ridge fall broadly within the Bronze Age, roughly 3000 to 1200 BC, a long century of social complexity in which alliances were forged and broken across mountains and rivers. When we measure the broken femoral fragments locals remember as too large, we find lengths that flirt with the upper bounds of normal human stature, longer than the average of surrounding burial populations, yes, but not so long as to demand an entirely new biological category. A femur of 48 centimeters, for instance, suggests a tall individual, perhaps in the vicinity of 2 meters when adjusted for population averages and joint articulations. It does not, however, prove the existence of an entire race of colossi. Consider the site in its full context. A socketed bronze axe recovered from the same layer measures 22 centimeters from pole to bit, and bears a patina whose isotopic signature aligns with regional copper sources that stretch across central Anatolia. A cylinder seal impression depicting a human figure with raised arms beside a horned animal motif resonates with wider symbol pools that travel along trade routes linking the Hittite sphere to Aegean artisan networks. When we add strontium isotope analysis of tooth enamel from the skeletons, We learn that at least some individuals were not local in childhood. They may have been migrants, warriors carried on the currents of exchange, or members of marriage alliances that moved women across valleys as part of kinship strategies. Migration patterns like these can produce pockets of unusual stature when nutrition, genetics, and selective marriage habits line up for 1 or 2 generations. In other words, the presence of a handful of taller-than-average individuals is entirely consistent with known social dynamics of the Late Bronze Age. Yet bones do not speak alone. They are translated through memory and ritual. The mason who hauled rubble from the roadcut remembers a femur as longer than a plow beam, and his metaphor refracts both the physical shape of the bone and the cultural weight of a tool that structures agrarian life. Oral testimony is a living archive that both preserves and perfects stories. Details accrete like lichen on stone. Villagers will tell you, with the blunt delight of local dramatists, that once their grandparents saw giants walking the ridge. The slippage between giants as a rhetorical device and giants as an empirical claim is where our work must be careful. We read the bone measurements, note the regional trade links, catalog the seal imagery, and then we listen deeply to what the people say. They will tell you why it matters that something out of the normal was found there. It marks a boundary in identity, a story they used to signal that their valley was once central to things larger than itself. The story spreads in different idioms. In the peat-bogs of Northern Europe, preservation works like a slow camera, stopping moments of violence, and clothing in tan and dark hues. Bodies, some with hair still braided, others with rope marks about the neck, surface after centuries as if offering a rebuke to the complacent gaze. Radiocarbon dates for these bog people often fall in the Iron Age and Late Bronze Age, roughly 500 BC to 1000 BC for many well-known examples, periods when ritual landscapes and community identities were keenly contested. Skeletal metrics here show ordinary human ranges, but the dramatic preservation encourages a particular kind of storytelling. When people see skin and hair, when faces are so well preserved they seem to stare back, the impulse is to explain why such a fate befell them. Folk songs about giant kings sinking into the marsh are part sympathy for the drowned and part an attempt to give scale to social trauma. Scientists will point out that the bog's chemical environment is uniquely suited to preserving soft tissue. Culturally, however, such preservation can scaffold myths about exceptional individuals, enlarging them beyond their biological size. We cross continents to meet the book itself in its most complete form, the Ethiopia-bound Ge'ez manuscripts where the Book of Enoch was copied and recopied with fierce devotion. The Ethiopic tradition preserves whole sections, astronomical reckonings so precise in their cadence they seem to unscroll the night itself, catalogues of angelic names that assert jurisdiction over winds and stars, sections that narrate the descent of the watchers and the dire fruit of their unions. Read out loud in a quiet library, the text cadence carries a rhetorical insistence. This is not only a story but a moral architecture. The giants are more than bodies. They are signposts of cosmic disorder, and their destruction is not merely physical but ethical, a reweaving of the social fabric. When Enoch intercedes, when he ascends visions of heaven, the text frames transgression and restoration within an apocalyptic logic. Sin ripples outward into creation itself. The book complicates matters because it interleaves genres, mythic historiography, astronomical instruction, and ethical exhortation. When the watchers descend, the text offers a moral allegory about boundary crossing. Beings meant to guard the celestial order instead fall in love with earthly forms, and the consequences are monstrous offspring and a breakdown in the human order. Some scholars read this literally, as an origin myth explaining monstrous physical forms in a human past. Others read it allegorically, as a polemic about transgressive elites or about the dangers of esoteric knowledge. The archaeological record does not answer this hermeneutic knot. It can only provide a substrate, the bones, the burials, the material traces, that the text then claims to interpret. Here we must be precise. The book supplies taxonomy of transgression, not osteology. It organizes moral causality rather than biological classification. Across the Atlantic, megalithic monuments stand testament to organized labor and belief. Passage tombs in the North Atlantic with corbelled roofs and aligned apertures, Andean terraces rising like steps to the sky, stone circles that mark horizons and ritual calendars. Monumentality explains some of the giant talk we hear. When architecture dwarfs the human body, stones the size of small houses lifted and set in place. Oral cultures naturalize that scale by imagining hands and bodies of matching stature. The narrative is not always literal but symbolic. Giants become metaphors for the social forces that could marshal such labor. Ethnographers and archaeologists reading these sites together note that megaliths often encode labor, ideology, and control. The persons credited with their construction are mythicized into founders and ancestors. A tall founder is easier to sing about than a complex mobilization of corvée labor and social obligation. But let us bring in the bioarchaeology again, because metrics are not merely pedantic. When osteologists measure diaphyseal length, look at cortical thickness, and chart pathologies, they work like careful translators of a body's life. A thick cortical bone suggests heavy workload, certain enthesopathies indicate repetitive strain, healed fractures speak of survival in a world of risk. A taller-than-average femur combined with isotopic evidence of a childhood diet rich in animal protein suggests that stature was partly nutritive and partly genetic. Cases of unusual growth can come from a host of pathologies, including endocrine disorders, but those are rare and usually identifiable by a suite of bone changes, not by length alone. We will show you how to read a skeleton with the same slow care you would use when reading a manuscript, margins, context, and the pattern of where all matter. A single long bone is a note in a complex score. The trade networks that braided these sites together are crucial to understanding how giant imagery traveled. A motif on a cylinder seal can be traced stylistically across hundreds of kilometers because artisans imitated, translated, and adapted images as they moved. Similarly, the chemical signature of metals tells a story of exchange. Copper from a mountain range becomes an axe head in a coastal town. Salt tracks across routes and enables nutritional equilibria that influence stature. When we map these flows, giants often appear not as biological categories but as reflexive symbols in a web of transformation. A trader bringing rare metal might be spoken of as larger than life not due to height but because he introduced goods that altered local life. Those metaphors stick and harden into legend. There are moments when the material record resists tidy explanation. A burial cluster in a high plain may contain a few individuals whose bone chemistry indicates childhoods in different regions of the continent. They are interred with grave goods that evoke distant horizons, the kind of beads made of marine shell far from the sea, weapons of a metallurgical tradition not locally known, pendants stamped with motifs crossing cultural boundaries. The social reading is compelling. These may have been high-status strangers, founders, or exogamous partners whose presence signaled alliances. The myth-making that follows is equally understandable. Communities attach provenance stories to these outsiders, inflating their attributes until they stand as boundary-defining ancestors, sometimes described as giants, in the language of awe and difference. Direct invitations to imagine these scenes are not mere rhetorical flourishes. They are a necessary method for empathy. Picture, again, walking the foggy trail at dawn towards the ridge, the dirt still soft underfoot, a small child clutching a copper ring in a palm smudged with field soil. The field director measures the ring, 2.1 centimeters, stamped with an upright figure whose arms are raised in a gesture of benediction or command, and names the layer, Late Bronze Age, about 1200 BCE. Imagine a woman in that same layer whose teeth show traces of an isotopically marine diet, who may have grown up by the coast and married into an inland valley as part of a long-distance alliance. Imagine the conversations she witnessed, stories of distant kings, envoys whose skins smelled of salt, rumors of monstrous births in another province. Human lives were braided with movement, with rumor, with myth-making. The giant label may have coalesced later as a way to make moral sense of those encounters, or to guard genealogical claims to land and power. Still, for all the careful parsing we do, there are anomalies that refuse to be fully absorbed into any single theory. A cluster of unusually large teeth found in a cave burial might suggest an unusual diet, An isolated burial with traces of a pathologically elongated long bone may indicate a medical condition or a celebrated member of the community who gained legendary status in life and death. We must resist reductionist exhilaration. Not every striking artifact is an evidence of giants card. Instead, we catalog, date, and cross-reference. We present multiple lines of analysis, osteological metrics, isotopic geochemistry, contextual artifact study, oral histories, and then we sit with the discomfort of ambiguity. That is precisely where the Book of Enoch sits as well. It is an architecture for explaining ambiguity, for giving moral shape to a world in which boundaries blur and the human experience is interrupted by the otherwise. When the book tells of stars that fall and of angels that breach their posts, it is mapping an anxiety about cosmological order. That anxiety was not only theological, it was also practical. Societies worried about the erosion of customary law, about elites who hoarded esoteric knowledge, about the moral risks of boundary crossing in marriage and trade. The giants of Enoch function as a dramatic embodiment of that worry. Whether or not a skeleton is physically larger than our own bodies, the narrative significance of giant can be enormous. The label mobilizes outrage, explains famine and disease as moral retribution, and justifies purgative violence in the name of cosmic repair. Reading the book alongside the bones and the stones helps us see how metaphors became policies, how cosmology could be wielded to sanction earthly actions. And yet, none of this should reduce wonder. Standing on a cold plateau with wind roping across your jacket, stones set like teeth against the landscape, you will feel the same vertigo the ancients must have felt when they saw a line of stones and imagined a body vast enough to set them in place. Our work is to translate that vertigo into something honest, to show you where data supports a claim, where it only suggests it, and where it is silent. We will keep presenting multiple competing theories because truth in the archive is not a single beam of light but a spectrum refracted through contexts of preservation, myth, and motive. We will let the bones speak in their language of growth plates and pathology, and we will let the text speak in its language of boundary and consequence. We will let the people who live in these places speak in their language of memory and song. We still don't know, and that is not failure, it is an invitation. The story invites you to keep looking, to push beyond the headline, to measure bones and listen to elders both. It invites you to imagine the fogged ridges and the peat-bog faces and the manuscript margins annotated by fingers that lived centuries ago. It invites you to hold the Book of Enoch and the burials in the same hand and to recognize that each is a different kind of witness. Some witnesses are bones, some are words. Together, they offer a fuller, more complicated account than either could alone. Keep walking with us. Keep listening. Keep measuring. Keep imagining. Qumran, where scrolls whisper of watchers and the hillside keeps its own secrets, begins our next long look. Imagine the canyon ribboned with limestone and scrub, the cave mouths like dark mouths in a jaw of rock. Picture the jars with their linen-wrapped scrolls, the mud brick ruins of a settlement that scholars once labeled a sectarian library. The caves themselves date broadly to the Hellenistic and early Roman periods around the 3rd century BC through the 1st century CE. But their contents are older and more variegated: biblical books, sectarian manuals, and fragments of texts like the Book of Enoch in Aramaic that no longer survive in full elsewhere. Here the Book of the Watchers appears not as an isolated oddity but as part of a living conversation about angels, law, and apocalypse. The single-sentence truth you can carry up the track is stark. In these caves, fragments of Enoch sit beside the bones of a community wrestling with the same cosmic anxieties the text encodes. When we read the Aramaic shards, we see wording that differs from the later Ethiopic. We see editorial choices, scribal emendations, theological glosses, that tell us how different communities reshaped the book to serve present needs. The archaeological context matters because it grounds the text in a social world. The Qumran settlement shows architecture adapted to communal ritual: mikvoti, ritual baths, communal eating rooms, jar caches. Pottery typologies anchor occupation phases. Ribbed cooking pots and collard-rimmed jars index the centuries with a precision archaeologists trust. Radiocarbon dates from the linen and charcoal typically cluster in the 1st centuries BC through CE, and paleographic study of the scripts places many scrolls in the same narrow window. Yet the Enochic materials themselves, Aramaic fragments, are often copied from earlier sources, which implies a textual tradition reaching back into the Second Temple period's deep past. In other words, what lies in the jars is an accretion of voices. We must not be tempted to treat the cave as a single frozen deposit. It is an archive of editorial action across generations. Now, let's be fair, the scroll fragments are brittle and partial. A line here, a column there, sometimes only a proper name survives. But even fragments have freight. The Aramaic witness to the Book of the Watchers preserves angelic names and sections of the narrative that emphasize transgression and cosmic order. In the material world around the caves we find evidence of precarious subsistence, pastoralism, seasonal foraging, pottery repairs. The community that curated these texts lived in a world where purity, access to sacred knowledge, and the maintenance of boundary lines between us and them were existential concerns. When the book dramatizes boundary collapse, celestial sentries mating with daughters of humanity, it performs, in rhetorical form, what the community fears in social terms: the collapse of order, the contamination of ritual purity, the politicization of esoteric lore. Multiple theories compete about how literally to read the giants in these texts. One scholarly line argues for a largely metaphorical reading. Giants, or Nephilim, are moral allegories for social elites who transgressed community norms by hoarding knowledge and acting tyrannically. Another, more literalist approach treats the text as preserving ancient memories of anomalous burials or unusual skeletons, perhaps of outlier individuals whose physical exceptionalism prompted mythologizing. A third, philological approach foregrounds textual stratigraphy, suggesting that later editors reworked older mythic motifs into new theological frameworks. The giants we encounter in the scrolls may be late interpolations smoothing earlier cosmic imagery into a morality play. Which theory holds depends in part on what you privilege: the material economy of an embattled sect, the textual palimpsest of editorial hands, or the anthropological reality of bodies. We will measure enamel isotopes and read the script with equal care, but we will also listen to how later communities used the book to construct identity. Still, for all the fragments and jars, we still don't know whether the Nephilim of the scrolls began life as literal-sized aberrations, political metaphors, or rhetorical devices later historicized by readers. Picture yourself standing at the cave mouth at dusk, the valley below folding into shadow, the air thick with the smell of crushed limestone and time. You run your fingers, reverent and clumsy, over the cool lip of a jar in a museum storage room, imagining the linen that once wrapped scrolls now gone to dust. You think of the scribes, hands stained with ink, eyes trained for tiny letter forms, fingers folding papyrus like someone folding a life into a compact object. The scene humanizes the text. It tells you that the Book of Enoch was not born in the mind of an isolated prophet hovering above history. It was copied, annotated, preserved in community contexts where questions about law and lineage mattered. That social origin complicates any simplistic equation of the book with a literal zoology of giants. And yet the power of the imagery remains. We still don't know how much of the book's physical language of giants reflects actual encounters with unusual bodies and how much is a cosmological grammar for explaining moral and social failure. Fall eastward with me now to an expanse of earthworks and burial mounds that dot the forested river valley of North America's eastern woodlands, the Adena and Hopewell cultures, spanning roughly 1000 BC to 500 CE depending on region, left barrows, elaborate grave goods, copper plates, and geometric earthworks that astonished 19th century onlookers. The one-sentence teaser: in these earthen tombs people once claimed to find the bones of giants, but the tale is braided with looting, tall-tale journalism, and early archaeology's growing pains. When European American newspaper men arrived in the early 1800s, the mounds were already the focus of local folklore. Accounts in the press, often sensationalized, declared human bones 6 feet long, monstrous in size, captioned with engravings meant to sell papers. Professional archaeologists later established typologies and careful measurement protocols, demonstrating that the vast majority of burials conform to biological norms for human stature. Yet the story is not merely one of debunking, it is a story about how modernity first meets deep-time landscapes and how power, property, and race inflect archaeological narratives. Archaeologists cataloged artifacts with increasing rigor: mica-covered copper sheets, platform pipes, and finely made pipes of carved stone indexed a ritual complex centered on exchange networks stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Radiocarbon dates later anchored these practices in the Middle Woodland period, roughly 100 BC to 500 CE, and osteological analyses of skeletal assemblages showed average statures consistent with hunter-gatherer to early agriculturalists in temperate North America. Measurements matter: tibial lengths, femoral diaphysis, pelvic dimensions. Osteologists recorded them and showed that the claimed giants were rare outliers at best, often arising from mismeasured or incomplete remains or from conflating animal bone fragments with human bone. Still, the cultural performance persists. For settlers and frontier communities in the 19th century, the idea of enormous preternatural builders fit a narrative that justified displacement and offered a theatrical counterpoint to contemporary anxieties. Some used giants to suggest a vanished race superior to indigenous peoples. Others, in a more romantic register, imagined an earlier human grandeur humbling modernity. Multiple explanations therefore coexist: sensational press, measurement error, and the social uses of myth. But there's another layer. Looting and the illicit antiquities trade warped the archaeological record long before professional standards could stabilize. Grave robbing disturbed contexts, mixing bones and artifacts from disparate periods and producing composite assemblages that looked stranger than they were. The result was a kind of archival noise that, in the absence of stratigraphic control, encouraged grand narratives. When we accept that colonial-era collectors often ignored context and that 19th century illustration and editorial practice had incentives to embellish the giant reports fall apart. Yet those reports also reveal the human hunger for cosmic scale, to feel connected to something vast and lost. Picture yourself at a deforested mound at midday, the cut earth hot underfoot, a fragment of copper glittering like a miniature sun. You can imagine the first excavators, trowel in hand, their notebooks stained with sweat, their pens hungry for a story. We still don't know how many narratives of giants were born from simple human fallibility, and how many were willful inventions with political purpose. Turn now to the high Andes, where terraces terrace the slope like steps to heaven, and where stones ring with the memory of hammer blows. Names should be precise. Tiwanaku around Lake Titicaca, flourishing from roughly AD 400 to 1000, the Nazca Lines on the southern coast laid out between 100 BC and 800 CE, the later Inca polities knitting much of these into imperial zones in the 15th century. The one-sentence tease: in the shadow of the Andean sky, giants are not just bodies but ancestor concepts tied to monumental labor and astronomical inscription. When we examine Tiwanaku stonework, its precisely dressed blocks, polygonal joints cut to the millimeter, we find extraordinary technical skill, not necessarily literal giant laborers. Measurements of blocks and their lift points reveal sophisticated engineering, pulleys, ramps, and human teams working in coordinated core, not single bodies of gargantuan size. Still, the local myths turn the builders into tremendous figures, ancestors who could command the mountain. Those myths serve as cultural shorthand for feats that do not fit everyday experience. Material traces in the Andes also give us diets, movement patterns, and ritual economies that complicate giant talk. Stable isotope analyses of human remains reveal highland diets rich in maize and tubers for some populations, high-protein llama pastoralism for others, and trade in marine products for coastal polities. Such diets influence stature but within human normal ranges. No osteological assemblage from these contexts convincingly demonstrates a population of anatomically gigantic humans. However, a particular funerary practice at some sites, a display of large cranial modifications, elongated skulls achieved by intentional binding in infancy, produces head shapes that seem other to outsiders. This is a crucial anthropological wrinkle. Bodily modification can be read as a literal sign of difference, and then mythologized as evidence of another species or class. The giants, here are sometimes those who carried their ancestors' prestige visibly on their skulls. Multiple competing theories vie for primacy. The monumental as metaphor thesis, monuments produce myths of giant builders. The functionalist engineering thesis, human communities with organizational sophistication achieve these feats. And the anthropological threshold thesis, bodily modification and elite diets produced individuals whose appearance to outsiders seemed extraordinary. None of these eliminates the others. They are complementary lenses that, when combined, tell a richer story about how people make meaning from scale. Picture yourself at dawn on a Titicacan shore, the lake like hammered glass, stones stacked beside a ruined temple, llamas bleating in the near field. Imagine the collective labor, men and women hauling, chanting, eating together, behind every megalithic face. Imagine too a child whose skull would be bound and whose head shape centuries later would be read as the sign of a giant by an astonished later eye. We still don't know precisely how ancient Andean communities experienced and narrativized their monumental past, but we do know that scale creates stories that transform into ancestor myths. In each of these segments the pattern repeats, a place with striking material or textual traces, a single sentence teaser that compresses its mystery, careful attention to dates. Bronze Age Anatolia, Iron Age bogs of Northern Europe, Second Temple Qumran, Middle Woodland mounds of North America, Tiwanaku and Nazca in the Andes, and a weighing of multiple competing explanations. Each site teaches a lesson in humility. Artifacts and bones constrain stories but rarely determine them fully. We continue to measure, to radiocarbon, to trace isotopes, and to listen to the stories people tell at hearths and at cave mouths. We keep the Book of Enoch in one hand and the trowel in the other. We read the giants as both material and metaphor, as politics and physiology, as ritual and rhetoric. And when the tally is done for a site, we breathe a small sigh for the persistent presence of unknowing. We still don't know. There is a rhythm to these journeys. You move from a single bone to a landscape, from a line in an ancient text to the room where it was copied, and in that movement the past refracts into possibilities. Let us turn then to southern Africa, where the ruins of stone at Great Zimbabwe rise like a heartbeat out of the plateau, a labyrinth of dry stone walls, conical towers, and enclosures that once contained a bustling mercantile city. Think of the polished walls catching the late sun, the shadowed alleys where merchants traded beads and gold dust, and the enormity of a place that, by the 11th to 15th centuries see, organized labor and wealth at a scale that startled visitors centuries later. The one-line tease would be this: in the echo of Great Zimbabwe's stone, people invented giants to explain the scale of human achievement and to anchor claims of ancestral grandeur. When early European chroniclers encountered the walls, they could not imagine local societies capable of such work and thus invented external builders. Tall, mysterious strangers, whose supposed presence served colonial narratives of incapacity and wonder. Here the giant is political. The myth serves external agendas even as local oral histories rework the past to assert continuity and legitimacy. Materially, Great Zimbabwe offers sober testimony to human organization, architecture showing sophisticated dry stone technique, imported ceramics linking the site to an Indian Ocean trade network, and beads and coins that chart far-reaching connections. The stones themselves register labor, tool marks, quarry scars, and a clear logic of assembly that a field team can trace. When we read the site against the Book of Enoch's appetite for boundary tales, a different kind of mapping emerges. Giants are not literal laborers but metaphors for the coordination of human bodies under cosmologies of power. The site's ruins became, in later centuries, a theater for competing stories, some proclaiming autochthonous mastery, others projecting foreign authorship. The giant story here becomes a rhetorical device that others use to flatten living human complexity into a single dramatic image. But here's where it gets tricky. Oral traditions from the region include not only claims of superior past builders but also accounts of ancestral figures whose stature and deeds exceed the ordinary. Those figures hold moral authority. When communities speak of giant ancestors, they often mean founders whose memory enforces social order. The archaeological record cannot easily adjudicate between a metaphor used for political ends and an embodied ancestral memory that shaped kinship claims. We can date pottery and trade beads. We cannot, with material remains alone, recover the social performative act in which giant becomes a claim to lineage and land. Still, for all the architectural precision and the beads that tell of oceanic connections, the answer to whether great Zimbabwe stones were set by literal giants is negative. The more important truth is how the giant image was used by people, both colonizers and the colonized, to narrate power. Crossing the Indian Ocean and sailing toward the islands of the Pacific, we find different kinds of scale encounter, monuments and oralities shaped by oceanic mobility. In Polynesia, monumental Mary and Heiau carved into coastal cliffs are products of communal labor and ritual investment. The tallest figures painted on kappa cloth and the largest stone figures on some islands become focal points for stories about ancestors of exceptional proportion. On Easter Island, the Moai, gigantic carved heads perched on stone platforms, are the visible insistence of ancestor making at scale. The one-sentence tease, the size of the Moai crystallized ancestor veneration into a physical language of immensity, but it did not require a people of giants to raise them. Engineering, ritual labor, and a cosmology that invested rocks with personhood together produced the statues and the stories about extraordinary progenitors. Technically, moving coral and rock into place on remote islands required ingenuity, coordinated teams, rope and sled systems, and communal feasting to incentivize work. Anthropological studies show that construction often coincided with ritual cycles and chiefly competition, where creating larger representations of the dead signaled prestige. The giant then is again a social device, scale used to mark difference and to legitimize hierarchical power. Yet the sensory experience is immediate. Stand before a moai at sunrise and you feel dwarfed. Scale itself becomes an argument. Mythic narratives follow. Ancestors who could move mountains, whose footprints left wells, whose voices shaped the coastline. Imagine walking past a row of stone faces at dusk, the Pacific wind lifting salt across your jacket. The stories you hear feel as embodied as the stone, and for listeners across centuries the border between metaphor and biography blurs. Now imagine another kind of monumental encounter, one not of stone but of written enormity. Epic poems and oral epics in South Asia where the Mahabharata and Ramayana describe colossal warriors and literal giants. The one-sentence tease, in the subcontinent, giants are as much literary devices as historical hypotheses. They serve ethical ends and mnemonic architecture. When ancient bards recite battles where titans fall and cities shake, they compress complex social memories into narrative gestures. Archaeology in South Asia, Indus Valley urban plans, Mauryan fortifications, megalithic burials, gives us data points about social scale and organization, yet it rarely provides direct proof of anatomically gigantic humans matching the epics. Instead, we find the same pattern: narrative scale maps onto social and moral scale. But here's where it gets subtle. Some megalithic burial sites in peninsular India show elongated megaliths and monumental cairns associated with elite burials. Folk accounts that accumulated around these burials sometimes refer to giant rulers or protectors. These are likely symbolic translations of social inequality, larger monuments for larger social persons. When oral epics praise a hero's stature, they are praising social magnitude as much as physical size. Still, for all the bravery of epic verse and the archaeological evidence of complex societies, there is no osteological baseline showing a race of anatomically gigantic humans across the subcontinent. The giants here are performative, cultural, and ethical, told to enforce memory and to dignify group origins. We still don't know how many of these oral traditions reflect real social proportions long ago, and how many are the inventions of poets and political elites. Turn inward now, to the vast plains of Central Asia, where steppe peoples rode and where burial mounds, kurgans, hide treasures and human remains that once astonished travelers. The one-sentence teaser, kurgan burials, with their horse harnesses and gold adornments, encourage stories that equate martial prowess with bodily largeness, and early observers often conflated social dominance with physical gigantism. Excavations show individuals buried with lavish grave goods, riding gear, weapons, and sometimes elaborately worked gold. Osteological analysis reveals strong, robust skeletal builds consistent with equestrian and warrior lifestyles. Some travelers, dazzled by the gold and the heroic posture of skeletons placed on reclining benches, describe them as gigantic in popular accounts. Again, image and impact played a role. What complicates these accounts is the 19th century hunger for heroic races. Nationalist and imperialist narratives sometimes seized the kurgan record and turned it into evidence for ancestral giants who founded modern nations. The archaeological reality is far plainer. The burials reflect social hierarchy, wealth disparities, and specialized lifestyles that produce robust skeletons, which can be misread as gigantism by readers primed for heroic narratives. This pattern recurs in other regions. Robust skeletons become giants in the rhetoric of those who want to have an origin myth of scale. Still, for all the belts of gold and the array of horse trappings, the bodies in the kurgans fit within human norms. What is striking instead is the degree to which wealth and ritual practice could transform ordinary humans into figures that later imaginations would punctuate with extraordinary size. We will pause here and consider an essential methodological point that these global vignettes emphasize: the difference between extraordinary claims and extraordinary interpretations. Science demands replicable measurement, clear stratigraphy, and multiple lines of corroboration. Osteology, isotopes, DNA where available, contextual artifacts, and secure dates. Myth and memory demand different things: a coherent narrative, a moral lesson, and a social axis of identity. The Book of Enoch sits squarely in the latter tradition, but it also reaches for the language of the former by cataloging names, places, and sequences. That slippage, between a text that styles itself as revelation and a world of material traces that answer best in the language of stratigraphy, is precisely the space our inquiry must navigate. There are occasional anomalies that tempt us beyond caution. Reports from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, now mostly debunked, claimed discovery of skeletons much larger than human norms in caves, fields, and old burial mounds. Most of these accounts collapse under scrutiny: poor measurement, misidentified faunal bone, composite deposits from disturbed contexts, and sometimes deliberate hoax explain many sensational finds. Still, a stubborn few cases resist easy dismissal because records are incomplete and because early excavation methods were primitive. In such cases, the responsible path is not to leap to preternatural explanations but to seek the missing context. Where are the field notes, the photographs, the remaining specimens? Often the trail goes cold, leaving room for speculation that will not be settled until new evidence appears or old archives are recovered and reanalyzed. We still don't know which, if any, of these outlier reports hide something genuinely anomalous rather than the debris of human error. Parallel to osteology, the field of ancient DNA has reshaped some debates. When DNA sampling is possible, it can tell us about population structure, kinship, and sometimes surprising admixture events. It can show whether tall individuals belong to distinct genetic lineages or were local members with exceptional nutrition. Where ancient DNA has been sampled responsibly, it often deflates grand claims of separate, giant, lineages by showing continuity with local populations. But here's where it gets delicate. DNA preservation depends on environment. Hot, humid climates degrade nucleic acids quickly, and many tantalizing sites provide no recoverable genetic material. This absence does not prove anything. It simply means laboratory doors remain closed. In other words, genetic silence should not be read as confirmation of myth nor as its refutation. It stands as another layer of the archive, sometimes loud, sometimes mute. Throughout all these terrains, the plateau stones, the peat-bogs, the jars of Qumran, the North American mounds, the Andean terraces, the Great Zimbabwe walls, the Polynesian moai, the kurgan gold, we find the same human pattern: scale begets story, story begets identity. The Book of Enoch participates in this habit of the human imagination. It uses giants to dramatize ethical failure and cosmic disorder. It makes bodies into symbols. Our role, then, is to translate in two senses: to translate bones into lives, and to translate text into social contexts. When we hold a femur, we should measure. When we hold a text, we should parse. When we stand in a village and hear elders speak of tall fathers, We should listen to what the claim does for them now. And when the book speaks of watchers and giants, we should hear it both as theology and as cultural rhetoric tuned to anxieties about order and power. We still don't know. If there is a single thread that ties together caves of linen-wrapped scrolls and peat-bog faces, ruined stone towers and polished copper rings, it is this: humans have always needed stories that make sense of scale. When we encounter things that dwarf our immediate experience, a piled wall that a lifetime cannot explain, a bone that seems to stretch the limits of ordinary height, a parchment that insists the heavens were once looser with angels, we do not simply file these facts away. We weave them into narratives that answer not only the question of what happened but the question of what it means to be human in a world larger than ourselves. The Book of Enoch is one of those narratives. It sits in a long tradition that uses the language of enormity to ask ordinary questions about order, culpability, and belonging. To return to that text at the end of our journey, having walked in fog and dust in museum rooms and under windswept stone faces, is to appreciate that myths and bones are not competitors but collaborators in the human attempt to remember and to explain. We have walked many trails in this exploration, across an Anatolian ridge where a long femur becomes a metonym for difference, into northern bogs where preserved skin and hair sharpen the imagination, down into the Qumran jars where Aramaic shards keep alive a lexicon of watchers and names, among American earthworks where 19th century sensationalism and modern measurement meet in a tangle, up Andean slopes whose terraces convert human coordination into monuments that beg for ancestor tales, through the dry stone enclosures of Great Zimbabwe and across the Pacific to Moai that stare out over an ocean of meaning. We crossed into steppe kurgans and Indian epic fields and found, in each place, variants on the same human habit: take scale and make it speak. In some places the bones were taller than average and yet entirely human. In others, the stonework overwhelmed every visitor's sense of the possible. Somewhere else the scrolls mapped cosmic disorder onto human transgression. Everywhere, what matters is less whether giants literally stalked the earth than how the idea of giants shaped social memory. That shaping is where the Book of Enoch sits most vividly, not as an instruction manual for paleontologists, but as a moral map used by communities to locate themselves within a cosmos that had rules and punishments. Standing at the mouth of a cave in the fading light of day, you can feel how small a single human is next to the sweep of centuries. Yet the smallness is not defeat, it is context. The craftsman who stamped a ring with a human figure, the scribe who folded a scrap of parchment into a linen-wrapped jar, the elder who told a child of tall ancestors, each acted to make the present intelligible. The ring, the jar, the song, these are human scale, human hands translating the world into artifact and story. Archaeology supplies the patient tools for reading those translations. Osteology and isotopes, radiocarbon dates, stratigraphic maps, and microscopic residues do not annihilate wonder, they refine it. They tell us how many people worked a field, how far a child walked before burial, what diets favored a taller frame. Science offers variables and constraints. Myth offers a language for the values those variables expressed in social life. To hold both is to hold humility and awe at once. We also learned how narratives of gigantism have been used by many hands for many ends, some noble, some odious. The colonial chronicler who denied indigenous agency in the face of Great Zimbabwe's walls used gigantism as a rhetorical smokescreen. 19th century newspapers sensationalized mound bones to attract readers and to fit wider racial theories. Conversely, local oral traditions sometimes invoke giant ancestors as a claim to land and continuity, a way of saying, "We belong here because our forebears shaped this place." The Book of Enoch has been equally versatile. Theologians have read it as a warning against cosmic transgression, mystics as a revelation of hidden orders, and modern readers as a hook for every conceivable hypothesis about ancient beings. The ethical lesson is clear: stories of scale are tools, and like any tool they can be used to build or to break. Discernment requires looking not only at the artifact but at the context of its telling, who benefits from the story, who is silenced by it, and what social work the story performs. There is, importantly, a danger in equating the power of a story to its truth value. The Book of Enoch is powerful precisely because it addresses anxieties that all cultures share: The fear that borders might dissolve, that knowledge might corrupt, that unions across lines might produce catastrophe. Giants are the most vivid embodiment of those anxieties because they represent a scale of consequence humans can visualize. Yet magnitude of narrative is not proof of magnitude in skeleton. The responsible course, what we have tried to do across these scenes, is to separate rhetorical power from empirical claim without denying the moral and cultural force of rhetoric. A myth can be false in a literal sense and true in a symbolic sense. It can mislead us about bodies and still teach us about values. There is another kind of truth we should honor, the truth of lived experience. When a community remembers a giant ancestor, that memory anchors practices of kinship, land tenure, and identity. Archaeology can tell us how houses were built, how diets shifted, and how trade flowed. It cannot, by itself, reconstruct the felt quality of being a descendant who stands in a ruin and hears an elder name a progenitor, giant, with reverence. Memory is itself a kind of archive, less tidy than a lab result, more mutable than a radiocarbon curve, but just as real for the people who live by it. The Book of Enoch participates in such communal memory. It is a repository of imagery that communities have used to make sense of long-term risks and to enact moral economies. Listening to that use is vital. It tells us why the text persisted and why, giant, images resonated across time and space. At the same time, there is delight in the specificities, the way a femur measures against the human scale, the faint cut marks on a stone that reveal its quarrying, the ink-stained margin where a scribe corrected a line. These matter because they root wonder and labor. Monumental stones are the testimony of many hands working in unison. Preserved skin in a bog maps a bodily death into ritual practice or violence. A ruined jar contains an idea translated through text. When we trace those specificities, dates, measurements, lab IDs, isotopic ratios, we turn the abstract into the concrete, and that work honors both skepticism and wonder. We show reverence for the past by refusing cheap certainties and by applying rigorous curiosity. There remains, inevitably, a residue of not knowing. Even when bones are measured and texts collated, some questions insist on their opacity. Why this community adopted a particular monumentality, the precise reasoning for a burial rite, the full trajectory of a text's redaction across centuries. Unknowing is not a failure of inquiry, it is the engine of it. The Book of Enoch, with its watchers and its dramatic images, exists in part to fill such lacunae with moral cosmology. Archaeology exists to interrogate those fills with material questions. The fruitful stance is to treat both as necessary perspectives, allow the book to teach what it can about meaning and allow the bones and stones to teach what they can about practice. Together they create a conversation richer than either alone. At the emotional center of all this is a simple human truth. The impulse to imagine larger origins comes from a sense of smallness in the face of time and nature. Whether you stand before a moai, gaze at a hill of mounded earth, or read an ancient column that speaks of stars, the reaction is similar, an urge to believe in origins that match the scale of your feeling. That urge can make cruelty if it is used to justify exclusion or arrogance. It can make beauty when it knits communities together around shared inheritance and responsibility. Recognizing both potentials is the ethical task of any narrator. The Book of Enoch tells a story about the dangers of boundary crossing and the moral cost of misuse. Archaeology tells a story about the capacity of human groups to organize, to adapt, and to memorialize. Together, they offer a mirror. Our species can both create wonders and justify horrors, and part of our work is to choose which stories we live by. So what should you take away from this long walk? First, giants in these accounts are almost always more useful as metaphors than as zoological categories. The label, giant, packages social magnitude, moral alarm, ancestral prestige, and narrative drama into a single, memorable term. Second, the material world matters. Bones, stones, isotopes, and text constrain stories and provide a corrective to overheated speculation. Third, context is everything. Who tells the giant story, when, and to what end influences its political and cultural meaning. Fourth, persistence of wonder is not a vice. It is the human engine for asking new questions, for going back to the cave mouth, for cataloging a new artifact with patient hands. Finally, if there is a moral at the end of this exploration, it is this: to love the past responsibly. That love requires rigor, measurements, dates, multiple lines of evidence, and it requires humility, the willingness to hold mystery without converting it into certainty. The Book of Enoch will continue to speak to those who need its language of watchers and giants because it offers a way to think about order and transgression. Bones and Stones will continue to speak to those who want to know how people actually lived and labored. Together, they do a kind of justice to the past. They let us feel its scale without mistaking feeling for fact. Picture once more the fog-clung ridge, the peat-bog, the jars in their silent rooms, the Moai's stony gaze. Picture the hands, ancient and modern, that made and tended these things, quarrymen and scribes, elders and excavators, children and technicians. Imagine the stories passing between them like whispered trades of memory. Listen to how the words, giant, and watcher move in the air. Notice how they do work beyond literal description, how they discipline, explain, and console. Let us keep our trowels clean and our readings careful, our ears open to song and our eyes on the data. That balance, between reverence and rigor, between myth and measurement, is where the book can both be read and understood. Keep digging. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.